This was Russia's biggest wave of strikes on Ukraine for weeks. Reports suggest that Russia has conducted what is being called a record-breaking airstrike in Ukraine. On August 21, 2025, Russia launched one of its most intense aerial bombardments to date, primarily targeting key military and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, particularly in eastern and southern regions. This offensive includes the use of an unprecedented number of bombs and air-to-surface missiles, marking a significant escalation in the ongoing conflict. The Russian Ministry of Defense has claimed the strikes targeted Ukrainian military command centers, weapon depots, and air defense systems. Ukrainian officials have confirmed multiple casualties and damage, though they have yet to provide a full assessment of the destruction. The airstrike is described as the largest in terms of munitions used in a single day since the start of the conflict, with reports of over 200 missiles launched in a matter of hours. Key targets were concentrated in Ukraine's eastern industrial cities and the Black Sea coast, particularly near Odesa and Mariupol. Several dozen civilians and Ukrainian soldiers have been reported dead, with many others injured. The full extent is still being calculated. Analysts believe this strike is aimed at destabilizing Ukraine's defensive capabilities as Russian forces prepare for an even larger ground offensive in the coming weeks. The scale and ferocity of the airstrikes are drawing international concern, with multiple nations calling for a renewed push toward peace talks. However, Russian officials have dismissed any calls for a ceasefire, asserting that the strikes are necessary for the liberation of Ukrainian territories. How might this impact the war or the international response? The record Russian airstrike and its fallout could have far-reaching implications for both the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the broader geopolitical landscape. Here are some key factors to consider. 1. Impact on the war. This represents a tactical shift. Russia's use of such an intense airstrike marks a shift toward even more aggressive, large-scale air operations. This could signal a new phase in Russia's strategy, one aimed at overwhelming Ukrainian defenses and causing significant disruption to their ability to retaliate. Strain on Ukraine's air defenses. With hundreds of missiles and munitions being launched, Ukrainian air defense systems, including Patriot and S-300, will face unprecedented pressure. While Ukraine has proven resilient in fending off Russian airstrikes, there are fears that this bombardment will exhaust their resources. If Ukraine's air defense systems fail to intercept the majority of these missiles, we could see a breakdown in the safety of critical infrastructure. Civilian casualties and infrastructure. The strikes are likely to hit not only military targets but also civilian infrastructure. The risk is increased destruction of hospitals, residential buildings, and power grids. This would exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and could galvanize international efforts to support the country's reconstruction. Russian ground offensive. The airstrikes could be setting the stage for a new Russian ground offensive. Air supremacy is often followed by attempts to break through Ukraine's front lines, potentially targeting the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, where Russia has been trying to secure control. 2. International relationships. In response, NATO/Western support for Ukraine will continue. Western nations, especially the US, UK, and EU, have been ramping up their support for Ukraine with more advanced weaponry. In the wake of these record-breaking airstrikes, we could see a significant increase in military aid to bolster Ukraine's defense capabilities. The West may also intensify diplomatic pressure on Russia to cease hostilities, although Russian leadership has shown little willingness to relent. Increased pressure on NATO. With the scale of the strikes reaching new levels, NATO could be drawn into more direct support for Ukraine. However, direct intervention, for example establishing a no-fly zone, remains a highly contentious issue among NATO member states, especially with fears of provoking a broader conflict with Russia. Need for humanitarian response. There is likely to be a surge in humanitarian aid to Ukraine, as more civilians will need medical care, food, and shelter. International organizations like the Red Cross and UNHCR will face increased pressure to assist displaced persons, particularly those in the path of these intense bombardments. Diplomatic pressures on Russia. Countries like the US, France, and Germany have already condemned Russia's actions and are likely to renew calls for harsher sanctions or even more direct diplomatic consequences. However, Russia's defiance in the face of sanctions has proven its resilience, and they have continued to act with impunity. Some nations may also begin to push for more aggressive responses, such as sending additional peacekeeping forces into the region. 3. Geopolitical dynamics. Chinese and Middle Eastern influence. Russia's increasing use of force could open new doors for China and Iran to engage diplomatically. Beijing has maintained a neutral stance but has also expressed opposition to NATO's presence near Russia's borders. China might use this escalation as leverage to push its broader geopolitical agenda, possibly calling for a ceasefire to avoid further global instability. Shifting global alliances. As Russia intensifies its military operations, countries that were initially hesitant to take sides may be forced to reconsider their positions. The geopolitical landscape is constantly evolving, and the airstrikes could lead to a realignment of nations based on their interests in the outcome of this conflict. Even within the EU and NATO, there are factions that may advocate for a more forceful response, while others argue for de-escalation. 4. What is the long-term strategic impact? Is Ukrainian morale breakable? Ukraine's morale could be severely affected by these large-scale attacks, especially if it leads to more civilian casualties. However, past events have shown the strength and resilience of Ukraine's civilian population and military. Public support for the government and the military could increase, even as the stakes become higher. Are there any economic consequences for Russia? Continued escalation could deepen Russia's economic isolation, especially if the West ramps up sanctions in response. However, this strategy has not succeeded and Russia may double down on its Fortress Russia mentality, building stronger economic ties with China, India, and others. What about future peace talks? If the airstrikes achieve their goal of weakening Ukraine's defenses, Russia may push harder for a diplomatic settlement from a position of strength. On the other hand, if Ukraine manages to withstand this new wave of attacks, it could force Russia back into negotiations, albeit from a more precarious standpoint. The possibility of a military stalemate looms large, which could prolong the conflict indefinitely. These airstrikes could be a game changer in the conflict, altering the calculus for both Ukraine and the global powers involved. The longer this war drags on, the more the international community will be forced to confront the devastating implications for regional and global security. What are the international reactions? The international reactions to Russia's record-breaking airstrike on Ukraine will be crucial in shaping the course of the war and determining how the broader geopolitical landscape responds to the escalation. Let's break down what the different actors on the world stage might do. United States condemnation and military support. President Donald Trump slammed the airstrike, not just as an act of aggression, but as proof that Biden's no-offense posture was bankrupt. He argued that to win a war, you've got to strike back, and fast. Using sports metaphors and tough talk, he defended Ukraine's right to fight back into Russia. While he's condemning civilian terror, he stopped short of pledging boots on the ground, but hinted air support could be up for grabs, signaling a bolder, if cautious, pivot from his earlier diplomatic playbook. Diplomatic messaging. Washington could step up its diplomatic efforts to isolate Russia on the global stage, particularly through UN Security Council channels. Expect statements from key officials like Secretary of State Antony Blinken or National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, emphasizing solidarity with Ukraine and the need for increased international pressure on Russia. Risk of escalation. The US will have to walk a fine line. There's significant concern in Washington about pushing Russia into a corner that could lead to further escalation, such as strikes against NATO member states or the use of tactical nuclear weapons. That's why, while they will likely ramp up military and financial support to Ukraine, direct military intervention remains off the table. European Union will increase sanctions. It has already imposed multiple rounds of sanctions against Russia, but this new escalation could push for even tougher economic measures. The EU could target Russian energy exports, banks, or even impose additional asset freezes on Russian officials. Given Europe's reliance on Russian energy, this could be a complex decision, but the EU is likely to prioritize unity with Ukraine over any short-term economic repercussions. Increased diplomatic pressure. EU officials, particularly European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, are expected to increase diplomatic pressure on Russia and on other global players to take stronger stances. This could include pushing countries like China and India to rethink their neutral or supportive stance toward Russia. Refugee crisis. Europe is already home to millions of Ukrainian refugees, and further escalation will likely lead to more displacement. The EU might step up humanitarian aid, and European countries could face renewed pressure to absorb more refugees, which could spark domestic political debates, especially in countries like Hungary and Poland. China neutral position with strategic overtones. China has largely remained neutral throughout the conflict, offering political and economic support to Russia while officially calling for dialogue and peaceful resolution. However, Beijing has consistently opposed Western sanctions on Russia and may see this escalation as an opportunity to further distance itself from Western influence. It may issue a statement calling for restraint and peace talks while reiterating that Russia has legitimate security concerns. Economic and strategic support. China may use this moment to increase its economic ties with Russia, particularly in energy, like oil and gas, and defense technologies, filling the gap left by Western sanctions. China's growing role in Russia's economy means it could become an even more pivotal partner in the coming months, further tilting the geopolitical balance. Geopolitical leverage. China will likely continue its position of quiet support for Russia in multilateral forums, like the United Nations, but it will be careful not to escalate tensions with the West too far. Any overt military support for Russia could deepen China's isolation, especially with Western powers, so it may lean more on diplomatic influence than on direct military involvement. India neutral but cautious. India has maintained a careful stance throughout the Ukraine conflict, prioritizing its relationship with Russia while avoiding direct confrontation with the West. India has a long-standing defense relationship with Russia, and Russia remains one of India's largest arms suppliers. Given the ongoing strikes, India is unlikely to take a direct stance against Russia but may call for an immediate ceasefire and renewed peace talks at the UN. Balancing interests. India has also increased its relationships with Western countries, particularly in terms of trade and defense, and has benefited from Western support in its ongoing border tensions with China. However, India will be wary of alienating Russia, a key partner in its defense and energy sectors. India's next steps will likely be about finding a diplomatic balance between supporting Russia's sovereignty and maintaining its strategic autonomy. Middle Eastern countries, for example Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia etc. Turkey's position is unique because it's a member of NATO but has maintained good relations with Russia. Turkish President Erdogan is likely to call for a ceasefire and act as an intermediary, as he has in the past, in facilitating peace talks. Turkey's role as a mediator could become more prominent if tensions rise. Turkey is also deeply concerned about refugees from Ukraine flooding into Europe and might push for regional stability to avoid further migration. Iran is another country with growing relations with Russia, especially in terms of military cooperation. Tehran may not openly support Russia's escalation but could quietly provide moral support and increase its military coordination with Russia. Iran has also been a key player in energy markets, so any instability could affect both Iranian and Russian energy exports. Iran may see this as a chance to push back against US influence. Saudi Arabia's position is likely to be a bit more cautious. While it has largely maintained a neutral stance in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it will likely call for peace talks to prevent any further destabilization of global oil markets. The Saudi government has shown interest in boosting its own global influence and might call for a peaceful resolution that preserves its energy security. United Nations condemnation and humanitarian aid. The United Nations is likely to condemn Russia's actions, especially if civilian casualties rise. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, will continue his calls for diplomacy and peaceful resolution while appealing to both sides to abide by international law. The UN may escalate efforts to increase humanitarian aid to Ukraine, providing more resources for displaced people, medical care, and rebuilding infrastructure. Security Council dynamics. The UN Security Council will remain a battleground for competing narratives. Russia's veto power complicates any strong resolutions against its actions, but the international community might try to push through resolutions on humanitarian aid or sanctions in other forums like the General Assembly. Global public opinion. Growing frustration. Around the world, there's likely to be growing frustration with the prolonged war. Protests or public demonstrations could erupt in various countries, especially in Europe, as people demand stronger actions or a ceasefire to end the bloodshed. Public opinion in nations supporting Ukraine may also shift if the war escalates and costs rise, potentially influencing political decisions in places like the US, Germany, and France. The big question is how the West will balance its support for Ukraine with the risk of provoking Russia further, especially as China and India hold significant sway in this conflict. What are the emerging military strategies likely to be after this attack? Delving into military strategies during this heightened phase of the conflict gives us a clearer understanding of how Russia and Ukraine could navigate the evolving war and what the global powers might anticipate. Russia's military strategy is that of escalation and disruption. Russia's recent record-breaking airstrike points toward a shift in tactics, moving beyond the initial phase of territorial conquest into a more destructive and disruptive approach. Here's what Russia's strategy might involve. A. Air supremacy and strategic bombing. Heavy use of air power. Russia is heavily relying on its air force, particularly bombers, to pound Ukrainian defenses. The Tu-95 and Tu-22M bombers, as well as Su-34 fighter jets, are likely to be deployed in these record strikes. This strategic bombing aims to break Ukrainian military morale, destroy critical infrastructure, airfields, radars, missile defense systems, and disrupt their logistics. Targeting supply lines and critical infrastructure, the Russians will likely continue their focus on supply chains and munitions depots in central Ukraine. By cutting off the flow of supplies to the front lines, Russia aims to create logistical nightmares for the Ukrainian military, weakening their ability to mount a sustained defense. Massive barrage of missiles, the Iskander short-range missiles and Kalibr cruise missiles have been key weapons for Russia. A barrage of 200 missiles in a single day suggests that Russia is attempting to overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses. The aim is to saturate Ukrainian defense systems, forcing them to exhaust their stockpiles of anti-aircraft missiles, leaving critical areas vulnerable. B. Ground operations, possible new offensive reinforced push in the east and south. Russia has historically focused on Donetsk and Luhansk as critical areas. If the airstrikes succeed in weakening Ukrainian defenses, we might see a reinforced Russian offensive aimed at breaking through the Donbas region and moving toward Kherson and Odesa, where Russia has strategic interests along the Black Sea. Encircling Ukrainian forces, Russian ground forces are likely to use encirclement tactics to trap Ukrainian units and force them into retreat. This could involve using smaller mobile units, T-90 tanks, and infantry units to outflank and cut off supply routes. Russia's infantry and artillery will likely be deployed to systematically wear down Ukraine's defensive lines, forcing them to either fall back or be destroyed. Urban warfare, if Russian forces target cities like Mariupol, Kramatorsk, or even Kyiv again, we can expect intense urban warfare. Russia's strategy could involve reducing these cities to rubble, forcing Ukraine to either fight house by house or evacuate civilians, which would be a humanitarian disaster. C. Hybrid warfare tactics, including cyber and psychological operations. Cyber attacks. Russia has been known for its cyber attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure, including power grids, communication networks, and transportation. Expect disruptions in Ukraine's ability to communicate with its military units, impacting their ability to coordinate responses and supply lines. Psychological warfare. Russia could increase its use of psychological operations, spreading disinformation about Ukraine's military success or failure. This might aim to destabilize morale within the Ukrainian population and among their allies by promoting fear, doubt, and confusion. Ukraine's military strategy is that of defense and attrition. Ukraine, on the other hand, has adapted a strategy focused on resilience, attrition, and strategic counterattacks. Their goal is to slow down Russian advances, force Russia into a protracted conflict, and leverage international support. Let's break it down. A. Defensive posture. Strategic deep defense. Layered defense strategy. Ukraine is increasingly relying on multi-layered defenses to absorb and repel Russian offensives. This includes fortifications, anti-tank trenches, and land mines along strategic areas, particularly in the Donbas and Kherson regions. Ukraine's goal is to slow down Russian advances, inflict high casualties, and create difficult terrain for Russia's mechanized forces to move through. Air defense systems. Ukraine will continue to rely on its NASAMS, Patriot, and S-300 air defense systems to counter Russian air superiority. They are likely to reinforce their air defense coverage around key military assets like airfields, command centers, and critical infrastructure to protect against Russia's missile barrages. B. Counteroffensives, strategic strikes and sabotage. Precision strikes on high-value targets. Ukraine's use of HIMARS, high-mobility artillery rocket system, and other precision artillery is a core component of its counteroffensive strategy. With Western aid, Ukraine has received long-range artillery that allows them to strike at Russian logistics hubs, ammunition depots, and command centers behind the front lines. These precision strikes are intended to disrupt Russian supply lines and reduce their ability to sustain offensives. Guerrilla tactics and special forces. As the war turns into a more prolonged conflict, Ukraine may increasingly rely on special forces and partisan-style warfare to inflict psychological damage and disrupt Russian operations deep behind the lines. Sabotage operations, such as attacks on Russian supply convoys, communications, and logistics depots, will become more prevalent. Counteroffensive in the south and east. Ukraine has shown its ability to regain territory when given the opportunity, especially after successful counteroffensives in areas like Kharkiv and Kherson. They may look to launch a new counteroffensive in the south, near the Crimean Peninsula, or east, aiming to recapture critical regions and disrupt Russian supply routes. C. NATO support, resupply and training. Advanced weapons systems. Ukraine's strategy relies heavily on Western arms supplies, which include anti-aircraft systems, artillery, anti-tank weapons, and drones. Ukraine will likely focus on securing more advanced weapons, especially in the form of tactical missiles that can hit Russian military targets farther behind the lines. Intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, from far, and training. NATO countries, including the US and UK, have been providing significant intelligence and training to Ukraine. This includes battlefield intelligence sharing, which helps Ukraine target high-value Russian units and predict Russian troop movements. Training will continue, especially in joint operations with NATO, enhancing Ukraine's ability to integrate advanced technologies. 3. Wider strategic considerations. NATO's role is mainly indirect involvement, although a key player in direct assistance. NATO's role remains primarily as a major supporter of Ukraine rather than direct military involvement. However, the alliance will continue to provide military aid, mainly weapons and munitions, intelligence sharing, and logistical support to Ukraine. This could also include the deployment of NATO military advisors to assist Ukraine with its counteroffensive strategies. Contingency planning for NATO. If the conflict escalates significantly, NATO will need to prepare for potential direct engagement. The Baltic states, Poland, and Romania are particularly vulnerable to Russian aggression, and NATO's strategic response could include reinforcing its eastern front with air and ground forces to deter Russian aggression beyond Ukraine. Russia's use of nuclear threats. Nuclear posturing. Russia's use of nuclear threats has been a significant part of its strategic messaging. Though it is unlikely to use nuclear weapons in a conventional sense, Russia may continue to threaten nuclear escalation to deter NATO intervention. This could impact Western military decision-making, especially if Russia's actions begin to affect NATO territory. 4. The longer-term strategic landscape. Stalemate or escalation. Both sides are preparing for a prolonged conflict, which could become a war of attrition. Russia's ability to maintain pressure on Ukraine will depend on its ability to sustain its military operations, whereas Ukraine's resilience and the flow of international aid will be key to its capacity to continue its defense and counterattacks. International pressure on Russia. As military setbacks mount for Russia, we may see shifts in the Russian leadership's approach. If the war drags on without clear success, domestic pressure in Russia could push for a re-evaluation of strategy, possibly leading to either a negotiated settlement or increased use of extreme tactics. The military strategies of both Russia and Ukraine are deeply intertwined with global support, technological advancements, and logistical realities. The conflict is likely to evolve with intense warfare, shifting tactics, and increasing reliance on high-tech systems and international partnerships. That's all for now. Bye and subscribe to receive alerts of new reports and/or videos.